Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Can everybody hear me okay? Yep. Lovely. First of all, thank you so much for coming out. My name is Valerie Piet. I'm the director of the International Observatory of Human Rights, happily called IOHR, which makes it a lot easier to say. It is my great pleasure to be here in Stockholm tonight. In 1993, the UN claimed this day as World Press Freedom Day. And I think for us, this annual commemoration of press freedom was very important for us to come all the way from London, and we came here to Stockholm because it was in Stockholm that press freedom actually was born. But it's taken more than 200 years for the UN to catch up. So today in Ghana is the 25th anniversary of World Press Freedom Day, and it's a great pleasure to welcome you here in Stockholm to be able to celebrate it together. However, the International Observatory of Human Rights wanted to do more than that. For us, Sweden was the first country to safeguard press freedom. And in 1766, when the Parliament passed that, the Freedom of Press Act, that prohibited censorship. In a world that we live in today, when censorship is becoming far more prevalent, it was very important for us to invite our Turkish journalist friends and Markin Shrivi, who's very kindly invited to come to join us in his hometown to discuss what we mean by world press freedom and what we can do to make sure that we keep it that way. This year, Sweden retained its well-earned slot as number 2 on the Reporters Without Borders index. And the Swedish style is always for understatement, so I'm very glad to see that you've kept that up and let Norway go in front of you. But to be number 2 in a world of 180 countries that are held to account is a huge achievement, and to hold that record is something that means that Sweden is doing something very, very right in this world, whereas our topic for this evening is Turkey, which has fallen 55 places and is currently down at 157. So something is wrong in the world in Turkey, and that's part of the discussion that we're here to have tonight. I'd like to thank Cafe Panorama also for hosting us all, because it's an amazing place to be here in the centre of Stockholm and the centre of cultural development, and it's very gracious of them to put us up all the way from London. However, IOHR's tagline is putting human rights into focus, and we do this through our web TV programs, we do it through our social media, and through our research projects. And the first research project that we did was on Turkish media. And the first event that we did was with the families of the Cumhuriyet journalists who are incarcerated in Turkey today. The first visit that we had with the UN was taking those families for a private meeting to discuss the state of Turkish media and the way that the state has continually censored, shut down and incarcerated journalists and anyone in the media that is involved in freedom of speech. In Turkey, the profession of journalism is under heavy scrutiny. Journalists can no longer convey the truth in safety, unless the truth is that the Turkish state has endorsed. Tweets now have to be censored in a world where social media and where online media has become just as big a part as the written page. We're at a point, and a tipping point, where we really have to consider, we live in a world of fake news, of fake information, but what do you do when the very journalists that are trying to report the truth are being incarcerated for doing so, or placed in exile? I go back to RSF and its indication of the state of media. In 2008, Turkey was ranked 102nd. 10 years later, today, Turkey ranks 157 out of those 180 nations. This is a damning indication of a system that has gone wrong, a system that is systematically broken. Before July 15th, 2016, the attempted coup, only 33 journalists were languishing in Turkish prisons. Since then, close to 250 journalists have been incarcerated or currently being held. On top of this, 2,300 media workers that we know about have been fired, and the government has terminated the operations of more than 200 media outlets. Almost every Turkish newspaper has been bought or shut down. This is in the run-up to the elections of the snap elections of the 24th of June. And we have to ask what kind of election where the press is completely muzzled, where bloggers and vloggers have to be hidden and abroad to be able to actually have an opinion about what should be an open election. The Free Turkey Media online hashtag campaign continues to grow in significance, and I would ask all of you to follow it and to not forget what's going on in Turkey today, that we have the ability to speak out when so many do not. However, it's my pleasure tonight, first of all, to thank the members of the Stockholm Center for Freedom, founder Abdullah Bozkurt and Levent Kanets, both Turkish journalists who are in exile here in Sweden. Thankfully not incarcerated, and likely, unfortunately, like so many of their peer group, able to speak out. And so tonight is a great pleasure to have them come to speak and tell their stories and tell you why they're here. However, it's also my great pleasure to start tonight's proceedings with Martin Schube, who's I was going to say, I'm looking at the numbers again because I can't believe 438 days incarcerated in Ethiopian prison. And I think about that, and I think about the different families of prisoners today that have to be able to say that. And I'm absolutely thrilled that you are here and not in Ethiopia and not incarcerated. And I'd like to welcome you all to say hello to Malcolm, hello to Martin, and I'm going to pass you over to him. So thank you so much.
Thank you. Bum. So thank you so much. In a way, I really wish that we didn't have to do this, to meet every year in May and talk about all the imprisoned colleagues and friends who are still languishing behind bars. But as long as they are there, we are here. And in a way, even though I'm free from that prison, I'm never totally free from the memories, and especially not from the sounds. And until this day, I remember that the first screams were always the worst. The frightening sound before the first stroke, and towards the end, the abused prisoner was always silent. It was the sound of torture. 6 disease-ridden cells around a small yard with inmates coughing blood, overridden with lice, fleas, and rats. But the worst thing with the federal police station, Makalavi, during this rainy summer was not the methods, but rather who the Ethiopian government had chosen to put there. Because every day when we were allowed 5 minutes outside the sun, you could see the other prisoners. And there was always a young woman who walked with her head high. And I thought to myself, what is her crime? What did she do? Did she kill someone? Did she steal something? And at one point, she blinked with her eye, and when it was my turn to enter the toilet, I found between 2 empty water bottles a small matchbox. And with trembling hands, I opened the matchbox, and in it was a letter written on toilet paper. And first it stood, when you read this message, please destroy it. But this is what she wrote. My name is Reot Alemo. I worked as an editor at the newspaper Addis Press before this regime had me arrested. Before that, I was a columnist at a newspaper called Fete, which means justice. I wrote many columns and articles which were critical of the government. That's why I'm here now. I'm glad we met, and I would like to meet again if they release us. But if you are released before me, tell the world that I'm not a terrorist, but a journalist working for the truth. And I remember the feeling destroying that letter, that I had ended up in something much, much bigger than just a journalist crossing a border hunting a story. And being a journalist would not set me free. My Swedish passport or my press ID would not set me free. It was not some misunderstanding that would be sorted out. It was just because I was a journalist that I was held there. And the fear of an Arabic Spring had led the Ethiopian regime to act rather than being acted upon and turn the situation into an African autumn. But through these letters we learned a lot, and we learned that in the cell to our right was also a journalist, Wubshe Taye, who we will have a message from, I heard here later on. In the cells in front of us and to left of us were all packed with journalists, radical students and politicians. And in another letter, Riot explained to us why she became a journalist. She could have chosen an easy profession, another life, but her love for her fellow human beings, for Ethiopia, made her be a journalist, and she stayed and she continued to write. And she showed what journalism could be and should be, but too often isn't. And she paid the price for the generations to come, the highest price she paid with her freedom. But she also gave me something else. As all prisoners of conscience, she knew that even though you were chained, robbed of your physical freedom, the freedom to talk or to be silent, and the freedom to drink or eat or even to shit. She knew that you had it in you to keep the most valuable, that freedom that nobody can take from you, the freedom to determine who you want to be, a journalist. And that attitude was contagious, and by putting on a journalistic armor, it was possible to see some meaning in all the suffering. And the dream would be that one day you would be free to tell about this and to bear witness about what you saw, that made you go up in the morning, take a teaspoon of cement and get to work. So if an interrogation turned nasty with threats of execution or lifetime in prison, you smiled, tried to remember the exact phrasing, stole a piece of paper and a pen, and then wrote it down back in the cell. Every day was just another day at the office. And thinking back, the most difficult part of the Kalite prison, which we later on were moved to, it was not the lack of food, the diseases, the torture, or that once a month a prisoner left with his or her feet first. The worst was the fear of speaking. It's not the guard towers or the machine guns that keep the prison population calm. The prison itself is built with bricks of fear. People who spoke politics were taken away. They disappeared. And this eats its way into your soul. And I remember waking up at nighttime, drenched in sweat, thinking I had said something negative about the government in my dream. And this feeling, this self-censorship, was worse than being shot, executed, or sentenced to 11 years in prison. And even in freedom, it took time to regain the freedom of speech and to understand that whatever I say here or later on today, I will not be put back behind bars. But back then, it got under your skin. And since my release, I have often been asked if the attention helps the imprisoned or not. And my answer is that attention is far more important than food and water. The support from the outside world is what keeps you going. And letters and speeches, it will not set anyone free today or tomorrow, but it will ease their day, because people will go with their head high, knowing that they are there for a good cause, that the suffering has a higher meaning, and that they are not forgotten. And after my release, I gave a lot of thought on who would be the next person to stand in trial for doing this job if this development is not stopped. And after a year, I got the answer on Al Jazeera from Egypt. And I think that what was referred to 10 years ago as a wolf at the door argument, namely that terror laws would be used against journalists, has now become a brutal reality in an increasing number of countries. The war on terror has turned into a war on journalism. And it seems like imprisoning journalists with draconian legislation is a cheap form of censorship without any consequences. And to tell you the truth, now that I'm back in the field, I'm more afraid of lawyers than landmines. And I think that if one more country gets away with prosecuting journalists, none of us will be safe any longer. And this rubber band legislation created to get at terrorists is being abused in Egypt, in Turkey, in Iran, Ethiopia, and China to silence, persecute, and incarcerate inconvenient voices. I'm not saying it was better in the good old days. This has always been a dangerous profession. Since the first AP correspondent, Mr. Kellogg, rode with General Custer to the Battle of Little Big Horn, We have always been shot and killed. But I would dare to say that we face a new situation, that international conventions that before has helped and protected us in war and peace has lost in respect. Conflicts are more messy. There is a lack of resources among the media companies, and most important of all, there is an insight among states, militias and armies that violence against journalists work, and this has created a perfect storm. By killing the messenger, they can silence the message. And soon, jailed, beheaded or shot colleagues are everyday news, and we are slowly getting used to an extreme situation. And I think that every day a colleague is jailed, the world should go bonanza, and we must find this strength. It should be like frying a panda bear at the local zoo. It should be a crime against humanity, a war crime. And I know this might sound a bit grand, but I'm not really neutral in these issues. It's personal, because press freedom is the freedom upon which all others stand. And I think that if the Geneva Convention was written today, the journalistic mission would have been much better protected. But despite all these difficulties, there is light. There is a growing movement for press freedom. I remember the hundreds of letters we received in Kaliti. I remember seeing the hundreds of thousands of tweets defending the Al Jazeera staff in Cairo, and all the articles and petitions written for the Turkish colleague languishing today in prison. And I think that whatever happens from here, we must never lose this extraordinary experience of solidarity, to fight for the jailed and killed as one. Because it shows that they can jail journalists, but they can never succeed in jailing journalism. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for sharing that. That's, I think, says it all, really. I think we've seen this week 10 journalists attacked in Afghanistan, not because they were there and caught up in something, attacked because they were there and they were the center of the attack. And I think it brings it back again and again that the war has changed. The rhetoric of terrorism is changing, and we're forgetting that underneath the people that are telling the true stories are the ones that now are under fire, and sadly now are adding to that very long list of, I think it's 38 people killed this year. And here we are in the beginning of May. Thank you so much. And can I now pass over to Abdullah Bozkurt from the Stockholm Center of Freedom, who's going to tell us a bit about his unique experiences and what's going on in Turkey. So thank you.
Thank you, Valerie. And after very passionate and emotional speech from Martin, it will be very difficult to top that. But situation in Turkey is, of course, quite dramatic. The numbers, just the nominal figures itself speaks a lot. And behind that, of course, there is individual journalists, there are family members, they have loved ones, and they are still, being punished on the account of journalists as well. My name is Abdullah Bozkurt. I am the president of Stockholm Center for Freedom, which is a new NGO, basically. We set it up with my colleagues from Turkey, all of them Turkish journalists. It's kind of new for us, new territory, because we never done the advocacy stuff, activism before, but I guess when we managed to come here, we sort of felt obligated to our colleagues back in Turkey who couldn't make it out. There are so many we know personally, some from the byline of the stories, some from the breaking stories. But as Martin pointed out, it's about targeting journalism. And it's part of the intimidation campaign as well from the government of Turkey to silence critical voices, to silence the journalists who actually doing a public interest job, covering the corruption issues, covering so many other social issues. Or in the Turkish case, we have seen in some instances, for example, the investigative journalists who dug up the Turkish government's connection to the radical and jihadist group in Syria and Iraq, they were targeted specifically and individually. It started out as an incremental approach. We have seen some indication after the massive corruption investigation in December 2013. And all of a sudden, the government started attacking the media outlets who were covering this, piece and information from the investigation file, which incriminated President, Prime Minister, he was at the time, then later became President, Erdogan, his family members, business and political associates. We have, for example, one of our colleagues here who spoke on a video conference before. He wrote a couple of books on this issue, and he had to flee Turkey long before the failed coup attempt because he was facing so many legal challenges, and he was going to end up in jail, so he fled to Turkey before the failed coup attempt. Just before critical election in November 2015, we have seen the Turkish government seizing, for the first time actually in our republic history, a third largest media outlet, which has 2 national dailies, 2 broadcasting stations. One is very popular, attracting a lot of audience on the news cycle, and 1 radio. So they just decimated the whole media outlets instead of going individual ones. And after that, it came the biggest, of course, the underdog, the Zaman Daily in March 2016, when the government fabricated criminal charges to create a pretext to seize the newspaper, which was the largest circulated newspaper in Turkey, with 1.2 million copies sold on a daily basis at its peak. And of course, after that, they started arresting journalists who used to work in these seized media outlets, starting from the editors, but they didn't stop there. They went all the way to the reporters, in some cases, even a driver of a chief editor, because he's sort of associated with the newspaper. So it's a wholesale approach, completely muzzling the critical and independent voices in the Turkish media, and sending a strong message, chilling message, across the board to all the others. If you don't toe the line, if you don't adopt the government narrative, then you're going to face the same consequence. You're going to be seized, and the journalists, editors, reporters, they're going to be ending up in the jail on trumped-up charges. And in many cases, unfortunately, they languish behind bars until the indictment gets filed, which takes sometime 1 year, sometime 1.5 years, without seeing a single evidence, if there is any. Because in our center, one of our actually mandate to keep track of these indictments, legal actions, the court papers, we have examined so many. We haven't found so far any single evidence that actually justify the imprisonment of the journalists. In most cases, the published articles, sometimes Twitter messages, sometimes just retweets. For example, in one case, the journalist retweeted a main opposition party leader, which receives almost 6 million votes in the national election, almost a quarter of the Turkish voter space, just because he retweeted the message posted by the main opposition leader. The prosecutor put that as a criminal evidence in the indictment. And there are so many absurd cases which my colleague Levent may refer in his presentation later on. But what is the motivation behind it? Why the Turkey is actually the worst jailer of the journalists in the world? We haven't seen the Turkey coming up before. What has changed? One reason, of course, because of the corruption investigation and the Turkish government's links with the jihadist groups. When they get exposed, Erdogan government panicked. They don't want that expose. That's one reason. But I think the main reason and the main motivation on the part of the Erdogan government in Turkey is he actually wants to transform Turkey, the parliamentary democracy that we have been enjoying for 200 years, even before the establishment of the Turkish Republic in the last century of the Ottoman Empire. We have seen the parliamentary democracy when we had the sultans ruling the country. And Erdogan government, he wants to change that into a sort of authoritarian, even autocratic and dictatorship, that only one man and his associates calling the shots, and all the judges and the prosecutors subordinate to his rule, and there is only one voice, and there is only one story to tell to the public. That's what we are hearing now. And unfortunately, as we are heading, as Valerie mentioned, the snap polls on June 24, there is no free environment for the media to express itself or for the opposition to find a voice in the critical, independent, or even opposition media. Only few media outlets left, which very limited circulation to the audience. And in Turkish case, so many people getting actually their news from the broadcasting station rather than the print media. And almost 100% is now controlled by the government of Turkey. But they didn't stop there, Valerie. They actually went further because the social media left for some time as the only venue for us and for others to express themselves, criticize the government, express their grievances on many issues. It doesn't have to be a political issue, it may be a social issue or educational matter. But the government went after the social media outlets as well, because the governments, they control the backbone of the system, the hardware and the infrastructure. They can easily suffocate and cut off the lines, which happen in many cases, especially before the election results get tallied up, just to distort the numbers for the voters. If you look at the Twitter, for example, the transparency report, which they issue on a 6-month basis, is amazing. Only in the category of how many court orders Twitter received from the foreign governments in the last 6 months, you can easily go and check the numbers yourself. Almost 90% of the legal judgments asking the Twitter to censor some of the messages or completely remove the messages came from one country, Turkey. We have almost 200 countries in the world, but the Turkey alone is composed 90% of all the judgments. In terms of the nominal figures, if I remember correctly, it's over 400 court orders. That shows, of course, the state of the judiciary in Turkey, which is pretty much in the pockets of the government. They can, fabricate charges using these loyalist judges and the prosecutors. Of course, another major concern for us now is not only they are using the anti-terror laws or the espionage charges. We have seen in Turkish case a lot of usage of defamation clauses, Article 299. Just to give you a comparison, then I'll stop here. In 2000, we had only four defamation cases against the president of the country, which may qualify as a legal case. Today, in 2017, we have over 4,000, from 4 to over 4,000 cases launched just on the defamation charges of the president. And there are maybe close to 40,000 already in the investigation phase, is not ended up in the indictment yet, but over 4,000 is already become an indictment, so some people actually charge for that, which carries a prison sentence, by the way. It's not just a financial penalty. I'll stop here, then if you have a question and answer session, I'll be happy to entertain.
Thank you so much. I'm going to move quickly along to Levent Kennets, because I think tonight we've got a lot of questions that people want to ask, and it's fantastic to hear the presentations first. So, Levent.
Okay, thank you very much for joining us today. I also thank you, International Observatory of Human Rights, and my organization, Stockholm Center for Freedom, for this opportunity to raise awareness of press freedom, particularly in Turkey. Of course, Sweden is the best appropriate place for such an event. And on this occasion, I remember with respect for all those journalists who died while they are committing their jobs. Today, I prepared a short presentation, consists of 2 things. First part will be my own story. Well, I don't want to talk about myself, but take it as a story of a journalist who's living in exile. And my second part will be about some factual information about the situation in Turkey right now. In 2015, my friends and I established a new daily in Turkey called Meydan. It was a very modest paper, similar to Aftonbladet or Expressen in Swedish version. And as soon as we established our newspaper, we become acquainted with prosecutors, lawsuits, the police, and persecution. There a lot of lawsuits. I really don't remember the number of it, but I do remember the first one. The first one was about Mr. Demirtas, leader of the third largest party in the parliament, currently in jail, unfortunately. Mr. Demirtas gave an interview to Deutsche Welle, Turkish section, not our paper, Deutsche Welle. We quoted a few sentences from him. There is an interviewer, there is an interviewee, and we are the only conveying a few sentences. But the lawsuit is filed against us. I don't know why. I was accused of insulting the president. Mr. Demirtas is talking, and Deutsche Welle is public broadcasting, but I was accused of insulting the president. So weird. Also, Interior Minister of the time, my Turkish friends remember him very well. And another lawsuit, I would like to give an example. 6 police chiefs of 6 different cities of Turkey filed a lawsuit against us. Their petitions are same word for word. All right, that could be. They may be an advisor. The thing is, the year of the crime is 2014, but our paper was established in 2015. But anyway, the case still is going on, and there is a warrant against me for this. And among many, this is my favorite, because the lawsuit was filed just 4 months after our newspaper was shut down by the government. And this is quite sarcasm. It's about selling out friends, selling out partners, selling out. It's the same in Turkish. He says the salesman of the year as he's selling out his trade partners. And also there is a warrant against me because of this case. This case is still going on, and I told you before, the public prosecutor filed this lawsuit 4 months after my newspaper was shut down. Well, of course, every time it's not funny. This is another photo published by pro-government media outlets. This is a visit to a mayor in Diyarbakir. Unfortunately, the mayor still is in jail. And this is the photo of police surveillance, not a photo taken by a journalist. This photo was taken by the police, and they gave it to the pro-government media outlets, and they publish our photos as we are doing something covered secret agreements with PKK or anyone else. This is our first and the last anniversary. Those were the days I had some hair on my head. My friends are celebrating our first, and I'm the one cutting the cake. But a few weeks later, something bad happened. As you may easily recall, coup attempt emerged in Turkey. Well, it was a controversial coup attempt, so we put our note that it's weird because the people living in Turkey has a long experience and history of military coups took stage. So this is somewhat strange, so we took our note. It's quite weird. And of course, this note has a price. After 2 days later, I think, I received an SMS message from Prime Minister's press office that my press card was cancelled due to national security. National security, press card, what's the correlation? I'm not sure. So this is my answer. I put it into wastebasket and said, card is here, come and take it. Because in the message they told me that return it back. I said, it's in the wastebasket, come and take it. And they did, yeah, they did to come, they raided our office to take the card. And all of a sudden, on the evening of this headline is quite powerful. We are directly accusing the government of knowing the kickoff, knowing the whole scenario about the coup attempt, and government purposely didn't do anything to prevent it. In the evening of the day, police raided our office, tens of anti-terror unit policemen, I don't know the number of them, they got on our ground, they handcuffed me behind the back, then they took me to the police station. This is time I'm leaving the paper. And this is a quiet video. Now, this is the civil police car. And next to me there was a pistol. And I asked the police officer that, you're taking me as a terrorist, but you're leaving your pistol near me. He only smiled, well, as a smile of, you know, everything. And this is, this is the very famous police headquarters, the one in Vatan district. Now, the other day, I stayed in the cell one night, and that's the other day. I'm waiting the response of the prosecutor. Prosecutor will decide. Then, surprisingly, I was released. And this is my colleague, Gülizar, and our lawyer. We are released. But the danger is still going on. So, when I was stepped out from the courthouse, one of my friends who is very successful having rumors called me that you will be detained again. I said, come on, I've just released. No, there's a new wave of detention, so this time they will not release you. So I didn't decide not to go home. I go to one of my friends' home and try to play hide and seek. These are I think there are many, I see some journalists here. They all these kind of images. Well, I'm the number 86 out of 98. So I decided to flee the country because Turkey is no more safe for me and I can't do my job. And I crossed the river between Turkey and Greece. In summertime, it's so peaceful, but in wintertime, this river is very dangerous. Unfortunately, there are a few victims who were drowned in that river. And with some of colleagues, one of them is here. We were on the same boat. We crossed the river. The yellow side is Greece. The green side, other part, is Turkey. This is the last moment I saw my home country. So on August 15, 2016, I arrived in Stockholm. I really remember that it was a very, very cold day. And I thought, maybe many of me recall it, if it would be cold again tomorrow, I will leave this country, but it wasn't cold. I'm still here. So this is quite my personal story. My family is still in Istanbul. My wife's passport was cancelled, and there's a travel ban for her. One of my kids cannot obtain a passport, declined, because I cannot provide necessary documents. The embassy here doesn't give service to the journalists in exile. Unfortunately, they live in Istanbul. So far, they are safe, and I'm looking forward to meeting again. Now, this is the second part of my presentation. I will give you some quick facts and in a couple of minutes. The situation is far worse than you think. This is our motto in the Stockholm Center for Freedom, and this is also the headline of our first report on Turkish media. You hear that there are some human rights abuses, blah, blah, blah. No, it is very worse than you think, you can imagine. There are 254 journalists in prison. Now I will make a comparison with other countries, you will understand the fragility. 192 arrested, that means pending trial, they are in pre-trial detention, and they are waiting for the verdict. The other 62 are convicted, and they are pending appeal, but they're all in jail, unfortunately. On our website, in Stockholm Center, we have a database, which is in a searchable format. If you enter our list, there's a special banner for this, jailed journalists in Turkey. You could easily see any journalist in jail for our best information. Unfortunately, it's not easy to learn names. For example, there are about 80 TRT, this is state-owned television, employees. These names cannot appear any other list provided by some international or local press organizations. It took over months to take these names, so this is why our list is quite higher than the other lists. This difference is TRT employers, and Anadolu Agency, state-owned news agency. Now, there's a comparison between other countries and Turkey. Azerbaijan, Eritrea, Egypt, China, and like a skyscraper, Turkey is unfortunately the worst jailer of journalists in the world. Well, as a Turkish citizen, this situation makes me so sad. It makes me so sad. And Turkey jails more journalists than the whole world does. Well, this is the World Press Freedom Index prepared by Reporters Without Borders. This is the step of Turkey, 157th. Last year it was 151st. Today, this year, 157th. Decline is going on. Well, I will show you some photos. These are very prominent Turkish columnists. Şahin Alpay, the one in front, is a Swedish-Turkish intellectual, academician, journalist, writer. He spent so much time in Sweden, in exile, 30 years ago. The guy in yellow t-shirt is a very, very good friend of us and still is in jail. He's, I think, 65 years old. Şahin Alpay is recently released in terms of home prison. This is our young colleague. She surrounded himself, but anyway, she was handcuffed. This is another journalist. This is Nazlı, a prominent Turkish journalist. She is 74 years old. 74, and she is in jail. And she supported Mr. Erdogan and his leader Erdogan in their very difficult times in Turkey. When everybody was escaping from them, Nazlı was with them to support for their democracy revival. This is our young colleague, Emre Soncan. Emre was a presenter in state television 1 year ago. All of a sudden, he became a terrorist. So, what are the charges? In Turkey, there are some common, we can group it into 4 or 5. Membership in a terrorist organization, as you see on the screen, spreading terrorist propaganda, attempting to overthrow the government, and espionage. So these are very, very serious charges. So there should be so important evidence, powerful evidence. Let's see the evidences. Evidences, tweets, retweets, books, columns, bank accounts, and some silly things. Even subscription to a critical daily, especially Zaman, is evidence for prosecutors to profile you in the list of terrorists. This is how the situation dramatically changed after the coup attempt. The 187 media outlets were shut down. Among other, the persecution, it's also a huge unemployment in media sector in Turkey. And again, these are photos from the media outlets that were shut down. Peaceful demonstrators were persecuted by the police, severely, gas tanks. And so far, this is the old number because it's very difficult to access information in Turkey. There's a shadowy everywhere. And this is, some numbers are old. This is numbers in 2016. Journalists charged 839, but we believe that the real actual number is much higher than this. Again, the press cards canceled. Turkish government is doing this, first canceling your press card and putting you into jail and saying to the world, there is no journalist in jail. This is the tricky thing that Turkish government do. And apart from the other countries, in Turkey, some of journalists' assets were seized, their bank accounts were frozen. They have very difficult times in order to survive. And this is the final part of my presentation. Our best information, 132 journalists wanted by the government. And so how the Turkish government want these journalists, and I will show you an image. It's not a Photoshop image. It's not the image I created. It's the image created by the state news agency's poster. I think you're familiar. This is state agency publishing it 4 or 5 times a week. Well, I know the right one here, but the most dangerous one, where is he? He's around way. The most dangerous one is next to Will. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you so much, Levent. When you see it in numbers like that, it really does make you realize it is far worse than we think. And you know, the worst in the world. This is Turkey. This is places that we visited. It's places that you've worked. These are wonderful people of intelligent thinkers that are being locked up purely for freedom of expression and purely from doing their jobs. And I think, if I can start the debate, gentlemen, grab your microphones. I think my first question is following up on that to Levent, which is, does Turkish intelligence actually pursue journalists and dissidents in general outside of Turkey? Have you heard of exiled Turks being kidnapped and harassed in different countries? Because I saw that number of journalists that are being sought, and I wonder where they are sought.
Well, I have no doubt Turkish intelligence is watching the especially journalists in exile. I have no doubt for this, especially those in Europe and in the US, and sometimes state news agency publish some videos of Turkish journalists in the US, and now the employees of the state news agencies and the other government offices are working like spies, are working like intelligence men. I think Mr. Bozkurt has more experience on this. You can elaborate on this?
Well, I mean, we are seeing the Erdogan's long arm operating in Sweden as well and many other parts of the world. When I especially wrote about Turkish intelligence covert operation, exposing them in different situations, like with the jihadist group Al-Nusra and others, then you get a sort of increased threat level that I usually get every day. I know it's coming from some circles or some dark, offices in the intelligence branch, as sort of, trying to intimidate you not to speak up or write, even if you are living in exile. So the message is not just limited in Turkey. They are going overseas, trying to silence the critical voices. And unfortunately, some of the, colleagues of ours, because of family concerns or some other safety issues, they just, went under the radar. They stopped writing or speaking up for understandable reason, of course, because you are taking a risk here. But of course, this is a major concern. And so far, we haven't seen any journalists getting abducted. But according to Turkish president himself, 83 people got abducted from the critical group of the government. And these are usually from the less, developed countries or countries with democratic troubles, like Malaysia, Pakistan. We have seen that. But in Kosovo, for the first time in Europe, I think we have seen an abduction by the Turkish intelligence, and we're sort of cooperating with host countries' intelligence service. So it's a major concern.
And do you believe that Erdogan himself is responsible for directly ordering this harassment and these arrests? Or do you think it's something between the judiciary and the intelligence services and a bit of an internal struggle, or a bit of both?
Well, I think in some cases he personally does that, and he actually do it publicly. For example, in Cumhuriyet, former chief editor Can Dündar case, he said it in a public rally, so I'm not gonna leave you alone because you publish the Turkish intelligence sending arms with the trucks to the jihadist group in Syria. He was publishing those photos in the newspaper, so he said it and he followed on that pledge. In other cases as well, in our media group, which is Zaman, and he was publicly calling in the rallies not to purchase the newspaper, and we're going to pay the price, and we paid for it. I mean, they came in and raided our offices, hundreds of the police officers, ransacking the place, and arresting, some of our colleagues and shutting down the media outlet. No doubt, I mean, without any signal from the higher up, I don't think any prosecutor or the judges will be able to order that.
Yeah, I mean, I was deeply moved by the headline of Cumhuriyet the day after the trial a couple of weeks ago, and a very brave editor put the headline, forgive me for translating it wrong, which was, "History will shame you." And I thought, for an editor who's just watched his entire editorial team, editor, everybody he's worked with, go to prison for 7 years at least, that was an incredibly brave thing to do. How do you feel that the courts are being used as a tool for political repression? You know, we've seen it with Commemorates, and we've seen ridiculous charges being brought. What do you feel is the next step? I mean, do you think that the courts have any chance after the 24th of June, or do you think it's only going to get particularly worse?
Well, it will get worse. I mean, we are talking about a country who declared almost 1/3 of the judges and the prosecutor, over 4,000, as a terrorist overnight. That includes top justices, you know, members of the Constitutional Court. And all of a sudden, they were branded as a terrorist, and same goes for the, you know, other bureaucratic service, actually. The Foreign Service, 30% of the diplomats, they were declared terrorists overnight. I mean, that's maybe, you know, another chilling message in this whole, because the definition of the terrorism, as the Turkish government defines it under the emergency rule, is not just involved with violence or, you know, terrorism, but they declare a person or entity or a group as a terrorist without any evidence, and later they define that anybody who are associated with or came in contact with or affiliated with this group or entity or person also considered as a terrorist. My colleague showed me the poster, my wanted poster, so I'm a terrorist, like Martin as well. And now all these people listening to us, they came in contact with us, so they actually fall in the definition of the terrorists. So, sorry guys, you're all terrorists now for listening us.
Then I feel I'm in very good company. Martin, do you support the RSF campaign calling for the UN to instate a special envoy to deal only with the safety of journalists, and why?
I mean, there are a lot of laws being violated as it is, and my main concern is not the lack of international conventions, it's how those conventions are being violated, and that there is really states have learned that they get away with violating them. So it's a matter of straffrihet in Swedish. How do you say? When you commit a crime and you don't get punished, that's a core issue. Will another convention help that? I don't know. It's not bad, of course, but I think that at the end of the day, we have to look at what can we do as a profession, what can we do as colleagues, and how do we raise the stakes. I mean, how do we make it hurt to arrest a colleague? And I think there are many examples tried in that whenever a colleague is jailed, his or her articles are being published by a lot of major newspapers around the world. That's one way of, okay, if you try and silence this Turkish newspaper, all their stories will run in the New York Times, in the Washington Post, in the major Swedish dailies and so on. But I still see that has been tried in a small scale, but not really on a global scale. That would protect us, or give us some kind of protection, I think, with naming and shaming and raise the stakes more than finding a legal way to attack the perpetrators, the violators of the freedom of the press. So, yeah, I mean the battlefield is also new. I mean it's a new situation that we are facing with new kind of threats, and as soon as we learn to cope with, like violent groups kidnapping us, there's a new threat on the horizon. So we are always like training for the last war, and then. But one of the major dangers, as I see, it's really the terrorism legislation, and how it's being abused, and that's it's the greatest threat, because how could I do my job as a foreign correspondent if I'm only allowed to interview the government? If I'm not allowed to interview terrorist-stamped group, may it be Al-Shabaab or Hezbollah or you name it, we need those voices, or our understanding of the world will be cut in half. And you can already see that colleagues are censoring themselves. And it's not just groups, as you pointed out, carrying weapons in the desert or in the jungles. It's also legitimate political parties who are being terrorist labeled. So, and we can see that it works using this kind of legislation against us.
Yeah, I lived in Hong Kong in the run-up to the handover, And all of my friends in the journalist communities said the same. But they said the same after they'd left. They said in the run-up to handover, they were ashamed that they had to start thinking about their families and thinking about self-censorship. But they were also very cognizant of the fact that they had foreign passports and therefore the freedom to say things once they'd left. And I think with a UN envoy, possibly, that's the ability to start breaking through the fake news that we're seeing. Because if you're in a country where the only news that you're given is being censored, then who can you believe? Where do you get your news from? And possibly that's the only place that the UN can begin to push to start to break that chain. I think, what question for you, Martin, again, because you're here we are in Sweden, first country, 1766, that put its mark on press freedom. And it's still a very respected value. I mean, I love coming to Stockholm, and we're very, very lucky to be here tonight. But we can't say the same about other countries. We're talking about Turkey, I've been talking about China. You spent 438 days in that Ethiopian prison on baseless terrorism charges, and now you are founder of the Kaleti Foundation, advocating for freedom of press and defending jailed journalists. Can you tell us the importance of campaigning for jailed journalists and how that kept your story alive while you're behind bars?
No, it's a good question. I mean, your worst fear being a prisoner of conscience, being locked up, is to be forgotten. So, of course, in that sense, everything that moves or everything that happens on the outside, it gives you this kind of moral boost. And I mean, I try to remember that I was at the central station. There was a newspaper Express and had a live TV show there. You could write postcards and send to David Isaac, who's jailed in Eritrea. He's been there for 18 years soon. And you could write a postcard and then send it to him. I think those kind of things are really, really important. I mean, I don't think that he will get that postcard. But by doing it, you also show solidarity with his family and with his daughter. And so it's also something that, as I pointed out, doesn't set anyone free, but it's so important in giving, I mean, comfort to the close relatives and also to do something. But then, in the long run, also not forget that these colleagues who took these risks, they know why they are there. I mean, they are there because they choose this profession. So it's also important not to, pity them in that way, but to honor them for the journalism that also led them there, and be proud that we have such colleagues. But it's far more important than you can understand from the outside how much it means from the inside, and it's something that. I mean, if you listen to released Turkish colleagues when they give interviews, one thing that they point out is really how much it meant to see people being there during the trial. And I mean, from the outside you could think that anything that doesn't set the person free is kind of useless. It's not, because that's not what you demand. You just want, okay, if I'm going to be hanged, I don't want to be hanged in silence. You want someone to be there and to report it.
Yeah, I think for us, in sitting in London, we follow all of the live trial feeds and seeing really understanding not just the emotions in the court, but exactly what's being said, and being able to share that for us is a really powerful advocacy tool. And I think everybody has that ability, everybody has a hashtag, and it's really important that we don't forget. Abdullah, while you were chief editor, you're running a prominent newspaper in Turkey. We've heard about how it was ripped asunder. What do you believe, I'm assuming you would have been jailed had you remained in Turkey. What about your colleagues that, I'm always amazed by the forgotten. We have all of these lists, but as you've shown tonight, there's an awful lot of people that aren't on the lists, that we don't advocate for, we don't send postcards to at the moment. What would you suggest that we do to start helping you to highlight those people to the rest of the world?
Well, for one, as Martin pointed out, solidarity is absolutely crucial to keep us going and to keep many others going. Whether you're in jail or exiled, it doesn't matter. And that's for number one. And the second is a lot of challenges. I mean, especially working in exile, It's very difficult, as Levent pointed out. Accessing the information is quite problematic and difficult. Even compiling the list of the jailed journalists. I mean, we have, for example, know for sure that like 20 plus people also in jail from the State Broadcasting Authority. But since we couldn't identify with their names and which prison they are staying, we are not adding their names on the list. So there are so many different sort of help needed. But naming and shaming is one, but also sort of playing or leveraging a trade card, investment card against Turkey, because that's where actually it hurts the Erdogan government in Turkish case. It's not just about raising the rights and the freedom or violation on the international treaties, commitment as such, but if this process starts undermining his own government because of the economic difficulties, then he's going to start paying attention. And I haven't seen that played out by, for example, the European Union so far. That's very crucial to push or to nudge, the Turkish government, or to secure, the release of some of the journalists. I think Germany provided us a good example when a dual national, Deniz Yücel, was jailed for over a year without even an indictment. The German government played a hardball, and they, threatened with, sanction and sort of, cutting investment as such, and that played very well, and he was released. Although there was no decision from the court to release him. It was a political decision, and they just, take him out of the jail and put him on a private plane and, take him to the Germany. So that sort of things, I think, would help. But I want to underline Martin's point is very important. These people, they don't want to be forgotten. We are actually receiving letters in some of our colleagues saying, I don't want to be forgotten here alone, sending letters. Sometimes they may not get it, sometimes it may be censored. But I mean, at least they know somebody out there paying attention. That's why, even putting the names on the list, recognizing them, honoring them, I think is absolutely crucial. So I think that's it.
We've got snap elections coming up on the 24th of June. We've been talking about that. Levent, I mean, what hope is there for any sort of, with the deterioration of media at the moment, any sort of opposition coverage or even fair coverage in Turkey? And also, following on with that with Martin, what role do you think the European media or the world media has to cover Turkey where potentially the Turkish media cannot?
Well, actually, I'm not very optimistic. I'm quite pessimistic about the outcome of the snap election, also the media coverage about the election. Almost all media outlets, newspapers and TV stations were owned by Erdogan himself or indirectly by his close circle. So I don't expect a fair coverage about this. And before answering, in terms of press freedom, I'm not very optimistic because the journalists who are in jail are convicted. A few of them are acquitted. All of them are convicted. Some of them are released pending appeal, but most of them are jailed pending appeal. So the worst situation is still going on in Turkey, and that seems to be going on after the election, because nobody's caring about press freedom in Turkey, unfortunately, right now, but nobody cares. Journalists, not only journalists, about 70,000 people are in jail in these silly charges. So there's a climate of fear. So I don't expect that election will change anything in terms of freedom in Turkey.
I think the role is to, continue to do our job, because there is also a risk being becoming an activist in the wrong way, so to speak, to kind of putting our ethics aside and just becoming campaigners for a cause. I think, and that is difficult, because you will be reporting about colleagues, but I think the best thing we can do is just to higher our standards and try and do that reporting as professional as possible, and also never forget to let everyone give their best arguments, to always also try to get quotes from the jailers and from that other side. And I think that is one of the risks when we are, as a profession, so pushed into the corner, that just one example from the Philippines. It's a bit of a different context, but it's I mean, where many people are killed, though there is no war. I mean, and a democracy, of course, there are war and insurgents. But there was a debate a couple of years ago within the Philippine Journalist Association. Should we start to arm ourselves because we are getting shot and killed? Should we arm ourselves? And the result of that debate was that no, we just need to, take quotes from both sides and make sure those quotes are accurate. That's the way to stay alive. I'm just trying to make it a little bit complicated.
But do you think that's enough to protect journalists today? When we've seen, we've just seen 10 people killed in Afghanistan. We've seen killings in Malta. We're seeing the Philippines a lot, in Mexico. What else should we be doing as a civil society to protect our journalists and to protect their lives at this moment?
That's the thing, because what we journalists can do is keep on doing our job with the highest ethics possible. And we also, at this time, we can't afford any errors in our reporting. We can't afford them. So it's up to other than journalists to defend us. The civil society, the politicians, the UN system, those people need to step in. Those should be the activists, defending our profession. And those are the ones that we need to, the cavalry that we need to call for.
I think, we were talking earlier, we've recently interviewed an amazing man, an Ethiopian journalist called Wubshet Tai. And you'll be looking at his interview quite soon on IOHR TV. That's my plug for the night. But I think, I'm constantly, when we're advocating for journalists or other incarcerated prisoners around the world, I'm always worried about the impact that we have on families or on people that we don't know what might happen to them next. And I think you've reintegrated back into society from a terrible experience. But what did you find were your experiences? Wubshet is a perfect example. We were discussing earlier. I think he's a very brave man. He's still in Ethiopia, but who knows what might happen to him next, but also to his family, to his colleagues, the pressure that can be put on in very different ways.
The difference is huge. The most dangerous thing you can be is to be a local reporter and report about the country you live in or the society you work in. As a foreign correspondent, you go to places and then you go back home to, save Sweden and do your reporting. And that is why also, if you look at the figures, 90% of the killed or jailed are, local journalists. But whenever it happens to someone called Martin or Peter or Johan or something, there is, huge attention, which in a way is good, but you should be aware of that, those differences. And with that said, I think that everyone who experienced losing your freedom, it's a trauma in a way, and the way to deal with it is to write about it and report about it. So, for me, writing was the best way, like puking, to get everything out. And it's just, amazing to see Wubshet Tai and Eskindenegga and all the journalists who have been released now, how they are so calm and confident, and they don't seem afraid. Because earlier when you see journalists being released, including myself, you were, afraid in the beginning what you were going to say or not. And now you see a generation coming out of prison that's no longer afraid. And with that, a lot is won, and that is also very, very hopeful.
Yeah, this week in London we had a big event on counter-extremism, and we were very lucky to have a journalist, Theo Patnos, who was incarcerated. He was a journalist. He crossed over the border into Syria, and he was taken by al-Nusra. And you hear the torture that this man has gone through, and he's done an amazing interview. He's working with some youth programs for us. And yet he's calm, and he's found a stillness which I can't imagine the pain that he's gone through. So it was truly awe-inspiring to meet. And yet you think, why has this man have to go through this in the first place, just because he was trying to get a story? I think, and I'm very conscious I'd like to get some questions from the floor as well, but I think for me, one of my last questions is, what hope is there in Turkey? Do you think, and I know we're saying we don't see much optimism for an election, but we've seen what happens when you end up in a sort of dictatorship. So what happens next? And then what can we do as an audience, and what can we do as a society to help support Turkey moving forward and hopefully moving out of this rather dark phase that it finds itself in?
Well, Valerie, in the short run, it's going to get worse. It's already worse, but it's going to get much worse than today. But in the medium and the long run, I am actually very much optimistic for the Turkish society for two reasons. One is economy, of course, because if you go after critical and independent voices, not just on the media, but on the civil society and political opposition as well, then you're going to be undermining the system, actually. Nobody's going to be investing in that country because they don't think their investment and assets is going to be safe. We have actually seen a lot of Turkish businessmen moving their assets and the wealth out of Turkey. Forget about the foreign investors. And Turkey is very much dependent on the trade and outside investment because running, current account deficit all the time. So we don't have a lot of oil and hydrocarbon resources. So eventually it's going to hit the wall. When that happens, of course, it needs to roll back. All these, terrible things happen, and eventually find the right balance to be able to survive, economically. And the second reason, of course, the Turkish, population, demographically is very diverse. We have, Kurdish groups, Alevis and many others. So, I mean, you can put pressure to a certain level. It will eventually rupture, when it reaches to a critical mass. I think that's why Erdogan is very much terrified of this. So he doesn't feel comfortable enough, even though he has been winning so many elections, one after another. He doesn't feel secure. He's always angry, lashing out as such, bringing new measures to further put a crackdown on the society. For the international, community, what they can do for Turkey, I think, for one, is naming and shaming that should be kept up all the time. And in every opportunity, whether non-governmental organization or intergovernmental organization, we need to be able to mobilize our resources to be able to put more pressure on the Turkish, delegation when they come in there. Keep raising this issue on the table all the time and leveraging them with other improvements in the economy and as such. So, I mean, that is the key. You're gonna need to hit the Erdogan to the point that hurts most. Economy is the number one. The human rights issue, press freedom, he doesn't care. But when they start impacting on the issues that he cares about, then he's gonna start making an adjustment. On a final note, maybe on the foreign journalists, if I can comment, the crackdown in Turkey, the intimidation is not limited to the Turkish journalists. We have seen so many foreign journalists either get detained for long time, actually, sometimes briefly, and in some cases just denied at the border from entry to the Turkey, or conviction in absentia. We have seen American, French, Italian, British, so many other journalists, maybe over 30 people, are actually ending up in this case. I myself get sometime, get offers from international media outlets to write a story on Turkey because their correspondents on the ground in Turkey, in Istanbul or Ankara, they're afraid of writing up those stories. So that's how the situation becomes so terrible for the foreign journalists as well.
So, social media, we use Free Them All and Free Turkey Media. What else should we be promoting? What else can people do and where can they go? What do you use in Sweden? Is there something different for Turkey or for general incarcerated journalists?
As hashtags? No, I think those are being used, and of course, this day Free David is being used, also Free Gui Minhai, Swedish Chinese publisher who was picked from Thailand and taken to China. I think those are at the moment the most profiled cases in Sweden. So. And
Turkish translation of journalism isn't a crime is very popular in Turkey. Also can be used as a hashtag.
Maybe we should. When you say Free David, since the number is so overwhelming in Turkey, we are talking 252 currently locked up behind bars. It may be more in the future. Instead of using the general hashtag, which is good, by the way, it's a good strategy, but we also need to be able to use individual names. So we send a message, they are not forgotten, it's even remembering the names and honoring them. Maybe following up with the work they have done, because the government claims they are terrorists. No, they are not. They have published books, they have written articles, sometimes breaking stories for the public interest. maybe that's the way to go.
You've made us all terrorists tonight, so.
Yeah.
I don't think our problem is the lack of hashtags when it comes to, but yeah.
But one issue that troubles me in the Turkish context is even finding a lawyer to represent your case becomes quite challenging, because the government went after the lawyers as well. As of today, we have close to 600 lawyers are behind bars, which is unprecedented as well. In so many cases, the lawyers, they don't want to take the cases because they don't want to end up in the prison as journalists. And in some cases, unfortunately, we have seen they are charging so higher fees to take the case. I mean, internationally, maybe that's another way of helping out, you know, sending monitors, and as well as, you know, financing the lawyers, the fees, and as such, it may help out.
Are you, would anybody like to ask any questions from the floor? I think we've got a roving mic coming to gentleman with a red scarf. Could you just say your name for us, please, sir?
Yeah, my name is Peter Eriks, and my question is, what is the European Union doing in relationship to what you all have been talking about, and what we know about the situation in Turkey? How is the Union acting?
Well, they're actually having a similar debate in the European Parliament today, but we need more than, you know, just talking shop, you know, raising this issue. At the European Commission and the European Council level, we haven't seen much criticism to that respect or action to follow up on that criticism. On the European Parliament, we have seen some serious voices, especially linking up the improvement on the human rights and the press freedom issue to the revising the customs union that we had with the European Union since 1995. The Turkish government desperately needs that because it's very much outdated, and maybe, you know, linking that to improvement on the human rights or releasing the journalists is one way to go, but we haven't seen that action from the European Union so far. And of course, the migrant issue in 2015 is another downside for the human rights defenders and the journalists, because it actually gave a, you know, carte blanche to Erdogan government. As long as they keep the migrants coming from the east within the Turkish borders, then they're happy with that, so they're gonna tone down their criticism toward Turkey. So that's another, you know, unfortunate development we have seen on the EU side. We need them to be much more vocal, but not just the vocal, but follow up with the action.
What happened to the journalists and the people working at Cumhuriyet?
Well, in Cumhuriyet, they have received, you know, different sentences from 3 to 9 years, but on average 6 years, right?
No one in jail now.
7, on average 7. But they have not seized the newspaper. That's a good thing. But I think the government actually needs that Cumhuriyet, you know, kicking, you know, and keep publishing, because Cumhuriyet, although it's a small circulated newspaper, limited, you know, reach out, is sitting on the center left, which is, you know, as long as they keep publishing, they will agitate the mainstream or the center-right voters. So it's actually benefiting Erdogan to keep that newspaper alive in that sense. But by going after the individual journalists in the newspaper, they are sending a message to the others working for the newspaper: you need to toe the line, or there are some red lines you don't want to cross. For example, the former chief editor Can Dündar, who lives in exile in Germany now, he published, you know, very damaging photos and videos on this illegal arms shipment to the jihadist group. As long as they don't keep publishing similar investigation files, they will be okay, I suppose.
Any other questions? Gentleman here in the black. And if you can just give us your name first, that would be great.
My name is Taha. So even here in the Western world, and especially the US, we've been seeing like a rise of extreme right-wing parties and a change of rhetorics. Politicians are more often accusing journalists as being, and labeling them as being fake media. We've all heard the US president catcalling journalists and seeing the critical media as like a conspiracy against himself and his followers. Do you think this trend, the mistrust against media and critical journalists, will spread through to other Western countries and through Europe, especially like we have an election coming up in Sweden? And what can we as like private citizens do in this matter?
I'm going to give that to Martin, because I think this is a world that we have the word fake news.
I mean, I think first of all it's easy to accept, to not accept the conditions to debate it in that way. I mean, if you look at trust for the media in Sweden, for example, the trust for the media is very, very high. The trust for the Swedish public radio, or the Swedish public television, or the major newspaper, it's huge. But it's easy to kind of, Sweden is not the United States, but it's easy to kind of import a political debate unchecked. With that said, I think that, the rise of Trump, and especially how his election campaign was handled, I think that many journalists learned a lot. From that, and we have seen kind of after Trump, if you look at the years before, there was a lot of lack of confidence in many media houses, questioning, okay, how will we survive? There's this crisis in the industry, etc., etc. But I think what we see now is really people going with their heads high and saying that we journalists, we do an important job. We are vital for a democracy. So that is a good thing that has come out of this debate and the discussion. I think what we can do as journalists is that we need to be better at explaining how, what do we do at the office? How does it look under, the hoof of the how does the engine look? How do you plan a story? What thoughts are in your mind when you go to a country? How do you pick the persons to interview? Which one do you put in your story? And being transparent about the way you work as a journalist, that is a way to regain the trust that might be lost. I know I'm contradicting myself now, but I think that's one important thing to do, and I think we haven't been so good at doing that. What is the difference between just a blog that's not really researched or fact-checked from an in-depth investigative article? It's text and it's text, but I think we need to be better at explaining the difference and what we do as a profession, our craft, and by doing that, there is a future for what we do also.
How do you keep credibility as a journalist in a world where so many places it's become too dangerous to go and be that journalist on the ground? So you're having to rely on local stories, local journalists that may never get the byline, and it damages the credibility of global journalists when they physically can't go and get the stories that they used to get.
I think we need to adapt, and we need to start working in teams much more, and maybe we need to have people on the ground who don't have their names on the byline just for the reasons that you mentioned. We need to be smart. If we stop reporting, the world will go silent. We need to continue reporting, but we can't just run into the bullets, so to speak. And the world is changing, so maybe the future is really to work in teams, foreign journalists, and use the advantages that you have as a foreign journalist, and local journalists would use their advantages. Because also, the public demands a journalism of such a high quality that you can't really, it's impossible to produce just by coming down with a parachute and then leaving. So from that reason as well, you need to collaborate much more and to find ways to collaborate both within countries and on a global level.
A question to all of you. We've seen this sort of Cambridge Analytica. We've seen, the twists of Facebook damaging reporting by using data and manipulating the story around the edges. How do you see that moving forwards? And to go back to your point, how do you maintain that credibility in a world where people don't really understand the messaging that they're getting at the same time, the subliminal messaging almost by you? We've certainly seen on Facebook.
Well, of course, it's not easy. You know, one of the most fundamental challenges we, you know, as a journalist we are facing today, you know, it actually complicates our profession, you know. But again, as Martin pointed out, the best, you know, recipe and the remedy for this is actually best damn investigative journalism. And if we cannot do it, you know, alone, we need to be able to do it in teams, link up with others. Actually, there is a lot of, you know, going trend now across the border, different grants now issued for the investigative journalists. And when you see so many, you know, same talking points replayed over and over again, there's also a growing appetite in, you know, in the audience to get, you know, a real story. What's actually going on? You know, it may take some time to be able to, you know, dig out and find some, you know, fact-based issues to be able to report investigative pieces, but it's a worthwhile effort because at the end of the day, it really matters. And when we start talking about, you know, the fake stories is gonna fade away, but the real fact-based journalist pieces, we're going to be talking over and over, and we're going to be expanding on that. So we need to be able to keep doing what we do best, you know, investigate, you know, talk to all the sides, get the facts, and eventually I think when, you know, given enough time, it will be, you know, prevailing on the, you know, alternative or the fake news stories. But of course, when the leaders of the country, like Trump in the US case or Erdogan in the Turkish case, it puts another challenge, another burden on us, you know, to overcome. But I mean, we need to get used to this, of course. That comes with the territory.
Andy, I would like to add a few points. From the other perspective, readers and audience should learn not to rely on one unique source also. They have to criticize, double check. Not only journalists, also readers and audience have some responsibilities in spreading fake news, I think.
And on that point, do you see the rise of the citizen journalists? We're talking about journalists working in teams, working in collaborative groups, particularly in Turkey. What protections can you give to citizens journalists when they're not really allowed to use WhatsApp anymore, or Telegraph or Signal or whatever the app is that can protect them? What's available to them to be able to report where accredited or recognized journalists simply cannot today?
Well, citizen journalism is on the rise in Turkey, especially all the media outlets and sources are strictly controlled by the government. If the evidences are double-checked, of course, citizen journalism is a good way to prevent censorship of the government, and I do credit, but of course, because of the climate of fear, sometimes citizen journalists are also in danger. So anonymity is very important, and we should support anything to protect this anonymity.
And that's another downside to it, as we have seen in the Russia, you know, trying to ban the Telegram, and in Turkish case, they actually criminalize a secure messaging system called Bylog. So many people, just because they downloaded the software, they are labeled terrorists and prosecuted. And tomorrow it may be Signal or some other, you know, smart phone application. So that's another challenge. I think David Kay in the United Nations, you know, Freedom of Expression Envoy, he was very good in the report that, you know, actually touched on this issue, you know, criminalizing of the digital software. The anonymity safety is absolutely crucial, especially for the citizen journalists, to be able to securely, you know, connect to the journalists and others.
Any more questions from the audience? The gentleman here in the brown jacket. Our roving mic coming to you quick and fast.
Thanks for the organizers, actually. So I'm actually an academician and scientist, not a journalist, sorry. I came from Turkey and faced similar suffers like journalists. Hundreds of academicians and scientists as well detained and jailed in Turkey, and other hundreds have to flee from Turkey to other countries due to the dictatorial regime and suffering the same reasons, actually. So what would you say about the academic freedom in context of the freedom of speech in Turkey? It's similar to the journalist, actually. So, and what you think about the future of the Turkey in this on this matter? So, thanks.
I think on the same level, we have seen the crackdown on the critical, thinking and academic institutions as well. The government shut down 15 universities using the failed coup as a pretext. Some of them is very prominent universities that has been around for some time, and over 1,000 schools that was shut down as well, just for signing a peace declaration, asking the government to sign a peace with the Kurdish groups. They were prosecuted, for unbelievable reasons. I think the government is very much terrified of very well-educated population. I think the government, one government minister openly admitting on the television, when you look at the polling data, when the education level goes up, their support actually comes down. He was saying that, well, we don't need to build more schools and the universities. He's saying openly on the public television. Of course, this government doesn't like, critical thinking and academic houses in Turkey, and that's very unfortunate because so many very talented, very intellectual, academicians are moving out of Turkey. So it's a brain drain actually going on, which would undermine the Turkish government in the medium run. But they don't realize it, I suppose, because Erdogan is fighting a short-term survival game, just to stay ahead of the wind. Because if the rule of law comes back, that means he's going to have to respond to a very serious charges from the corruption to aiding and abetting jihadist group in Turkey.
I think that when we are measuring press freedom and looking kind of at the rankings and countries going up and down, I think we need new tools to understand the things that you point at, because you don't really see them in the regular press freedom rankings, because those are based on, okay, how many journalists are killed or jailed. But a situation where no one is killed or jailed, it doesn't have to be good. It could be that everyone just gave up their profession. So they are a bit, how do you say? I think we need new tools to measure the situation for people's ability and possibility to speak out, and not only look at the numbers in terms of jailed and killed, because it will not kind of grasp the situation in the countries. For example, we had the horrible murder of Kim Wall in Denmark. So now Denmark, goes plummeting in the press freedom ranking because she was killed by this sick persons. So these kind of figures, maybe we need a bit more, new tools to include the perspective that you were asking for.
Are there any more questions for this evening? Then it only says down to me to say thank you to my amazing guests this evening. It's been an incredible evening, and I think for all of us it really brings home why we should pay attention and why we should keep advocating and why we can't let silence fill the void when it comes to world press freedom. So thank you to you all on this rather wet night for celebrating World Press Freedom Day, and I really appreciate your attention. And all I ask is go out, use those hashtags, Free Turkey Media. You can see on IOHR TV, we'll be running this in entirety. If anybody wants to post, tweet or share, we'd be very grateful. And to the Stockholm Center of Freedom and Martin Schriebe tonight, my guests, thank you so much to you all.